In this episode, we connect cybersecurity risk to something that often surprises new learners: the rules outside the organization that can force security decisions even when no one inside is asking for them. Laws, regulations, and compliance drivers shape cyber risk because they change what counts as an acceptable outcome. If a business loses certain kinds of data, it might face fines, lawsuits, mandatory public disclosure, or restrictions on how it can operate. That means the impact side of risk becomes bigger, sometimes dramatically bigger, simply because legal and regulatory consequences are attached. You do not need to memorize every law to understand this topic at a foundation level. What you do need is a clear mental model of how legal requirements influence security priorities, why different industries face different obligations, and how compliance differs from true risk management. The goal is to make these ideas feel concrete, so exam questions about governance and compliance stop feeling like vague policy talk. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Let's start by separating three related ideas: laws, regulations, and standards. Laws are rules passed by legislative bodies, and they apply broadly within a jurisdiction. Regulations are detailed rules created by government agencies to enforce laws, and they often apply to specific industries or types of data. Standards are not always laws, but they can become mandatory through contracts or industry requirements. For example, a business might not be legally required to follow a specific security standard, but a major customer may require it as a condition of doing business. That contractual requirement can be just as real as a regulation, because failing it can mean losing revenue or access to partners. On the exam, you may see questions that ask why an organization implements certain controls, and the correct answer may involve legal or contractual obligations rather than purely technical preference. Compliance drivers are the forces that push an organization toward meeting specific requirements. Some drivers are external, like privacy laws that require protecting personal information. Others are internal, like leadership decisions to meet industry expectations and avoid reputational damage. Compliance is about meeting defined requirements, and those requirements are often written in a way that can be checked, measured, and audited. Risk management is broader because it includes any risk to assets, whether or not a regulation mentions it. These two areas overlap heavily, but they are not identical. A company can be compliant and still insecure if it only meets minimum requirements and ignores other risks. A company can also be secure in many ways and still fail compliance if it misses a specific mandated control. Understanding this difference helps you answer questions that test whether you can distinguish checkbox compliance from risk-based decision-making. One reason laws and regulations matter so much is that they can increase impact through financial penalties and legal liability. If a company suffers a breach of personal information, it may be required to notify affected individuals, regulators, and sometimes the public. That notification requirement can damage reputation and trigger further investigation. Some laws allow regulators to impose significant fines, especially if the company failed to take reasonable protective measures. Laws can also create liability through lawsuits, where customers or partners claim harm from negligence. All of these consequences increase business impact, which raises risk even if the likelihood of the breach has not changed. This is why organizations often prioritize protecting regulated data types, because the downside of failure is amplified. Another key factor is that different data types trigger different obligations. Personal information, financial records, healthcare data, and payment card data often have special protections required by law or industry rules. Organizations must identify what data they handle and where it flows, because compliance cannot be managed if you do not know what you have. This connects back to asset identification and data classification, even at a foundational level. If an organization cannot confidently identify where sensitive data lives, it may fail to protect it and may also fail compliance. On the exam, scenario questions may hint that certain data is regulated, which should influence your control prioritization choices. When you see phrases like customer personal data or financial transactions, Think about heightened obligations and higher impact. Jurisdiction matters as well, because laws vary by country and sometimes by state or region. A company operating internationally may face multiple sets of legal requirements at once. Even if you do not memorize specific jurisdictions for the exam, you should understand that legal risk grows with operational footprint. Organizations often adopt baseline protections that meet the strictest requirements they face, because managing different rules for different locations can be complex. This is another way compliance influences security design. It pushes organizations towards standardized practices that are easier to audit and maintain. In exam questions, a common theme is that organizations must account for the legal environment they operate in, and that failing to do so increases risk. Regulations also affect timing and response expectations. In many regulatory environments, organizations are expected to detect incidents, respond promptly, and document what happened. This means controls for logging, monitoring, incident response planning, and evidence preservation become compliance relevant, not just operationally useful. If an organization cannot demonstrate that it monitors systems and responds responsibly, regulators may treat that as negligence. This ties compliance directly to the security lifecycle beyond prevention. Being able to show that you can detect and respond can reduce legal fallout and protect trust. On the exam, if asked what a regulated organization should prioritize beyond preventive controls, choices involving monitoring, incident response, and documentation often appear for this reason. It is also important to understand how audits fit into compliance drivers. An audit is a formal review that checks whether an organization meets specific requirements. Audits can be conducted by internal teams, external assessors, or regulators, depending on the situation. The presence of audits changes behavior because it creates accountability. Organizations document policies, standards, and procedures not only to guide daily work, but also to prove that expectations exist and are followed. Evidence matters in compliance, such as logs showing access reviews were performed or records showing vulnerability remediation. This documentation is not only for passing audits, it also helps organizations manage risk by making processes repeatable. Exam questions may test whether you understand that compliance requires both doing the work and being able to demonstrate that you did it. A common misconception is that compliance is the same as security. Compliance can improve security because it forces baseline controls, but it often reflects minimum requirements. Attackers do not care whether you are compliant. They care whether you are vulnerable. Therefore, risk management should go beyond compliance by addressing the organization's actual threat landscape and business priorities. Another misconception is that compliance is purely a technical responsibility. In reality, compliance involves leadership decisions, legal interpretation, policy creation, training, and continuous oversight. Technical teams implement many controls, but governance defines what must be done and ensures it is sustained. On the exam, if a scenario suggests that a compliance failure occurred due to lack of policy or oversight, the best answer may involve governance improvements rather than a single technical fix. Compliance drivers also influence risk treatment choices. For example, risk acceptance may be limited when regulations require specific safeguards. A company may accept certain operational risks, but it may not be allowed to accept risks that violate legal requirements for protecting data. In those cases, mitigation becomes mandatory, and avoidance might be chosen if mitigation is not feasible. For example, if an organization cannot protect a certain type of regulated data adequately, it may decide not to collect it, which is a form of risk avoidance driven by compliance. Compliance can also influence risk transfer, such as requiring certain contractual security commitments when outsourcing services. Understanding these interactions helps you reason through scenario questions that involve third parties and regulated data. Third-party relationships are a major compliance driver because organizations often share data with vendors, partners, and service providers. Even if a vendor causes the breach, the original organization may still be responsible in the eyes of regulators or customers. This is why contracts often include security requirements and why vendor risk management exists. At a foundational level, the idea is simple. If you share sensitive data, you also share risk, and you must manage it. That management includes selecting trustworthy vendors, setting clear expectations, and monitoring compliance. On the exam, if you see a scenario where data is handled by a third party, expect that contractual controls, oversight, and due diligence may be relevant. Finally, recognize that laws and regulations change over time, and organizations must adapt. This is one reason security programs emphasize continuous improvement and governance. Compliance is not a one-time project because requirements evolve and business operations evolve. A new product feature might introduce new data collection, which creates new obligations. Expansion into a new region might introduce new privacy laws. Therefore, compliance is closely tied to change management and ongoing risk assessment. The exam may not ask you to track changes in specific laws, but it can test whether you understand that compliance is dynamic and must be sustained through processes, not treated as a checklist you complete once. To conclude, laws, regulations, and compliance drivers shape cyber risk by increasing impact, defining mandatory requirements, and influencing how organizations prioritize controls and document their actions. Laws establish broad obligations, regulations provide enforceable detail, and contractual standards can be mandatory through business relationships. Compliance overlaps with risk management, but is not identical, because compliance often sets minimums while risk management addresses the full range of threats and business impacts. Audits, incident response expectations, and third-party oversight all become more important in regulated environments. If you keep one decision rule from this episode, let it be this. When a scenario involves sensitive data or regulated operations, assume impact is higher, identify the specific obligations implied, and prioritize controls that both reduce risk and demonstrate compliance through clear evidence.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.